Jorge Luis Borges' story, The Immortal, begins with a passage from Francis Bacon, the Essays, and it's an interesting sort of prefiguration of what's going on. So here's what Bacon says: Solomon saith, there is no new thing upon the earth, so that as Plato had an imagination that all knowledge was but remembrance, so Solomon giveth his sentence that all novelty is but oblivion. And Bacon himself is saying this much, much later at the beginning of the modern age. But what we have here is sort of a repetition of eternal thoughts, so to speak, comparatively done. And it sets the stage, and immediately Borges then jumps into telling a little bit of framing story about a manuscript that is found and the person who was selling the manuscript, right? The dealer. An emaciated, grimy man with gray eyes and gray beard and singularly vague features. He expressed himself with untutored and uncorrected fluency in several languages, shifting from French to English, from English to a cross between the Spanish of Salonika and the Portuguese of Macau, right? And it turns out that this person is supposed to have died by the time that the manuscript is actually found, and then we get the manuscript. Now, this is where the story really begins, and it is told by somebody who was originally a military tribune in Thebes, but he's got some lapses in memory, as we're going to see a little bit later. So he tells us, as I recall, my travails, my troubles, began in a garden in 100-gated Thebes in the time of the Emperor Diocletian. I had fought with no glory in the recent Egyptian wars, and I was tribune of a legion quartered in Berenice on the banks of the Red Sea. Now, Thebes, not the gated Thebes way up north in Greece, but in Egypt, right? And he says, there fever and magic consumed many men who magnanimously coveted the steel blade. The Mauritanians were defeated. The lands once occupied by the rebel cities were dedicated in Aeternum to the Plutonian gods. Alexandria, subdued, sought Caesar's mercy. Then he says, my travails were these. All that night I did not sleep. There was a combat in my heart. I rose a little before dawn. My slaves were sleeping. A bloody rider was approaching from the east, weak with exhaustion, a few steps from me. He dismounted and in a faint, insatiable voice asked me in Latin the name of the river whose waters laved the city's walls. I told him it was the Egypt fed by the rains, the Nile. And he says, it's another river I seek, the secret river that purifies men of death. So this is a legendary river, and we read more. He told me that the country of his birth was a mountain that lay beyond the Ganges, so over in India. It was rumored on that mountain that if one traveled westward to the end of the world, one would come to the river whose waters give immortality. He said on the far shore of that river lay the city of immortals, a city rich in bulwarks and amphitheaters and temples. So he learns of this, and he's like, I think I want to go find that. I resolved to go in quest of that city and its river. When interrogated by the torturers, some of the Mauritanian prisoners confirmed the traveler's tale. One of them recalled the Elysian plain far at the ends of the earth where men's lives are everlasting. Others tell other stories. And then he goes to consult the philosophers. And now here we're actually getting something, again, a little prefiguration of what's to come. In Rome, I spoke with philosophers who felt that to draw out the span of a man's life was to draw out the agony of his dying and multiply the number of his deaths. So immortality, considered philosophically by those philosophers, doesn't stave off death. It multiplies death in some way. So he says, I decided the task was enough. I didn't actually have to find the city of the immortals. I'm not sure whether I ever believed in it, but, I got 200 soldiers and I recruited a number of mercenaries who claimed they knew the roads. He says they were also the first to desert. And then we get this fantastic quest, right? Which is sort of following Greek, Roman storytelling. So let's just bring up some of the things that happened. We sent out from Arsinoe. We crossed the lands of the troglodytes, who devour serpents and lack all verbal commerce. The land of the Garamantas, whose women are held in common and whose food is lions. The land of the Ogoles, who worship only Tartarus, the unseen, deep caverns. We ranged the width and breadth of other deserts, deserts of black sand, where the traveler must usurp the hours of night, for the fervency of day is unbearable. From afar, I made out the mountain which gives its name to the ocean. On its slopes grows the euphorbia, an antidote to poisons, and on its peak live the satyrs, right? The bosom of these barbaric lands, where the earth is the mother of monsters, might succor a famous city. Such a thing seemed unthinkable to us all. And it's sort of a sunk cost fallacy. He says, well, we're on the quest. We may as well keep going. And then there's a mutiny. And he finds himself attacked, gets hit by a Cretan arrow, some of the mercenaries perhaps, right? And then we move into the second part of the story. Now he finds himself, is he going way back to the beginning? First we went to the land of the troglodytes. He finds himself among the troglodytes, right? But there's actually something kind of good about this. He says, at the foot of the mountain ran a noiseless, impure stream clogged by sand and rubble. On the far bank, the patent city of the immortals shone dazzlingly in the last or first rays of the sun. I could see the fortifications, arches, front pieces, and forums. The foundation of it all was a stone plateau. 100 or more irregular niches like my own riddled the mountain and the valley, and the sand had been dug shallow holes. From those wretched holes emerged naked men with gray skin and neglected beards. I thought I recognized these men. They belonged to the bestial lineages of the troglodytes who infest the shorelines of the Persian Gulf and the grottos of Ethiopia. I was surprised neither by the fact that they did not speak, nor by seeing them devour serpents, because that's what troglodytes are supposed to do. Now, he's bound, he's thirsty, and what he does is he closes his eyes and throws himself down the mountain with his hands bound behind his back. He makes it to the river. He plunges his bloodied face into the dark water, lapped at it like an animal, and repeats to himself some words of Greek, those from Zelia, wealthy Trojans who drink the water of dark Aesopus. And he says, I can't say how many nights and days passed over me, and I lay out there. The troglodytes helped me neither survive nor die. In vain did I plead with them to kill me, but then I managed to eventually free my hands of the bonds, right? And so he eats as well, his first abominated mouthful of serpent's flesh. And he says, out of avidity to see the immortals, to touch that more than human city, I could hardly sleep. He didn't know if the city's real or not. Now he can see it. And as though the troglodytes could divine my goal, they did not sleep either. At first I presumed they were keeping a watch over me. I imagined my uneasiness had communicated itself to them as dogs can be infected in that way. And so he leaves the village talking to himself, thinking they can't talk at all. And one of the troglodytes accompanies him to the last. And what does he do? Well, he goes to the city. He finds that there's no entryway into it from the plateau, but he does in fact seek refuge in a cavern because it's so hot. And then he finds something. Toward the rear there was a pit, and out of the pit, out of the gloom below, rose a ladder. I descended the ladder and made my way through a chaos of galleries to a vast, indistinct circular chamber. 9 doors opened into that cellar-like place. 8 led to a maze that returned deceitfully to the same chamber. The 9th led through another maze to a second circular chamber, identical to the first. I am not certain how many chambers there were. My misery and anxiety multiplied them, he says. But eventually, after he got used to that dubious world, he made it out. At the end of one corridor, a not unforeseen wall blocked my path, and a distant light fell upon me. I raised my dazzled eyes. Above, vertiginously high above, I saw a circle of sky so blue it was almost purple. A series of metal rungs led up the wall. I climbed that ladder. Little by little, I began to discern friezes and the capitals of columns, triangular pediments and vaults, confused glories carved in granite and marble. Thus it was I was led to ascend from the blind realm of black and intertwining labyrinths into the brilliant city. Now, what we have here is, of course, one of Borges's most favorite metaphors, that of the labyrinth, but the city itself is going to be quite striking. So he makes it to the city, and it's not what he expected. He says that he emerged into a small plaza. It was surrounded by a single building of irregular angles and varying heights. It was to this heterogeneous building. Now, heterogeneous of different natures, right, of different origins, that many cupolas and columns belonged. More than any feature of that incredible monument, I was arrested by the great antiquity of its construction. I felt, we're going to find wrongly, it existed before humankind, before the world itself. Now, he's reflecting on this building, which turns out to be a palace. And at first he thinks this palace is the work of the gods. Then he explores the uninhabited spaces. And I corrected myself. The gods that have built this palace have died. Then I reflected upon its peculiarities and told myself, the gods that built this place were mad. And he says, I said this, I know, in a tone of incomprehensible reproof that verged on remorse, more with intellectual horror than sensory fear. The impression of great antiquity was joined by others. Notice the descriptors here. The impression of endlessness, the sensation of oppressiveness and horror, the sensation of complex irrationality. I'd made my way through a dark maze, a labyrinth, but it was the bright city of the immortals that terrified and repelled me. It is itself a kind of labyrinth. A maze is a house built purposefully to confuse men. Its architecture, prodigal in symmetries, is made to serve that purpose. In this palace that I imperfectly explored, the architecture had no purpose. There were corridors that led nowhere. Unreachably high windows, grandly dramatic doors that opened onto monk-like cells or empty shafts, incredible upside-down staircases with upside-down treads and balustrades, other staircases clinging airily to the side of a monumental wall, petered out after 2 or 3 landings in the high gloom of the cupolas, arriving nowhere. And he says, I cannot say whether these are literal examples I've given. I do know that for many years they plagued my troubled dreams. Now, here is where we get a really interesting statement by him, summarizing it, this notion of cosmic horror. This city, I thought, is so horrific, its mere existence, the mere fact of it having endured even in the middle of a secret desert, pollutes the past and the future and somehow compromises the stars. So long as this city endures, no one in the world can be happy or courageous. So this is an expression of what we nowadays call cosmic horror, and he has found the city of the immortals. Now we move to the third part of the story. He manages to get out of the city and through the labyrinth again, and he says, those who've read the story of my travails will recall a man of the troglodyte tribe had followed me, as a dog might have, into the jagged shadow of the walls. When I emerged, I found him at the mouth of the cavern. He was lying in the sand, clumsily drawing out and rubbing out a row of symbols that resemble those letters in dreams. One is on the verge of understanding when they merge and blur. At first I thought this was some kind of barbaric writing. Then I realized it was absurd to imagine that men who'd never learned to speak should have invented writing, nor did any of the shapes resemble one another, a fact that ruled out or made remote the possibility they were symbols. The troglodytes are stupid people. They're not really human. But he decides that he is going to take this troglodyte, who he names Argos after Odysseus' dog, because he's kind of dog-like. He's going to try to teach him, to train him, to recognize a few words, right? And so he eventually gives up on that, and he says, I reflected that Argos and I lived our lives in separate universes. We don't even inhabit the same mental space. I reflected our perceptions were identical, but that Argos combined them differently than I, constructed from them different objects. I reflected perhaps for him there were no objects, but rather a constant dizzying play of swift impressions. I imagined a world without memory, without time. I toyed with the possibility of a language that had no nouns, a language of impersonal verbs or indeclinable adjectives. Many days went by with that. And then eventually it rains, and he calls, Argos, Argos. Then Argos reveals who he is. Argos stammered out these words, Argos, Ulysses' dog. Then without looking at me, this dog lying on the dung heap. And he says, how did you know lines from the Odyssey? And Argos says, he asks how much of the Odyssey he knew. And he says, very little, less than the meagerest rhapsode. It has been 1,100 years since I last wrote it. Argos is Homer, the bard, one of the immortals, right? So the troglodytes, as it turns out we find in the fourth part, are indeed the immortals. And becoming immortal has radically changed their perspective on things. And they did indeed have a city of the immortals, the one whose renown had spread to the Ganges. They destroyed it 900 years before this story. And he says, out of the shattered remains of the city's ruin, they'd built on the same spot the incoherent city I'd wandered through, what he calls a parody or antithesis, an opposite of the original city, which was also a temple to irrational gods. What kind of gods? Well, the irrational gods that rule the world, and to those gods about whom we know nothing save that they do not resemble man. They are beyond us, right? So what do? As he says, the immortals live in thought, in pure speculation, in self-absorption. They scarcely perceive the physical world. And he says, Homer explained these things to me as one might explain things to a child. And he actually reveals that he was the one who had lived for a century in the city of the immortals, and when it was destroyed, he counseled this other one should be built. So we not only find the city of the immortals, this military tribune discovers them, we also learn that it's not the first city. And the city that we have there that so horrified him is the, we could say, result of the lifestyle and the mentality of those who have attained immortality.